I just want to look at some simple lessons for us this evening from the book of Ezra. So if you want to follow, would you turn please to chapter 1 first of all of the book of Ezra. I'm doing a study on a Thursday evening on systematic theology, and I thought, shall I give them a dose of systematic theology tonight, or shall we look at something a bit more simple? So whilst that has a great interest for me, I think sometimes it's always good to remind ourselves of the very basics of the Christian life. And I've studied the book of Ezra, and it's a very good book, one that seems to be totally ignored in my experience. I've very rarely ever heard anybody speak from Ezra, but it's a fantastic book and well worth reading. Probably read it through in an hour quite easily. So I just want to this evening look at the first 2 chapters, not in a great deal of detail, just to pick out some lessons for us. So I'm going to read, first of all, the whole of chapter 1, and then a few selected verses from chapter 2. Excuse me. So the book of Ezra, chapter 1 and verse 1. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord God of heaven hath given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he hath charged me to build him an house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? His God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of the Lord God of Israel. He is the God which is in Jerusalem. And whosoever remaineth in any place where he sojourneth, let the men of his place help him with silver, and with gold, and with goods, and with beasts, beside the freewill offering for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. Then rose up the chief of the fathers of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and the Levites, with all them whose spirit God had raised, to go up to build the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem. And all they that were about them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, beside all that was willingly offered. Also Cyrus the king brought forth the vessels of the house of the Lord, which Nebuchadnezzar had brought forth out of Jerusalem, and had put them in the house of his gods. Even those did Cyrus king of Persia bring forth by the hand of Mithridath the treasurer, and numbered them unto Sheshbazzar, the king of the prince of Judah. And this is the number of them: 30 chargers of gold, 1,000 chargers of silver, 29 knives, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem. Now the first verse, please, of chapter 2. Now these are the children of the province which went up out of the captivity, of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his city. Now over to verse 64, please. Excuse me. Verse 64, chapter 2, the whole congregation together was 42,303 score, beside their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. Their horses were 736, their mules 245, their camels 435, their asses 6,720. And some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, offered freely for the house of God to set it up in his place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold, and 5,000 pound of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So the priests and the Levites and some of the people and the singers and the porters and the Nethinims dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. And I'm sure the Lord will bless the reading of his word this evening. Now, Ezra gives us, I believe, some very challenging lessons. It was written by Ezra himself, and we read about Ezra from chapter 7 and onwards. Now, if you look at the end of 2 Chronicles, the book obviously just before Ezra, you'll see that the closing verses of 2 Chronicles are very similar to the opening few verses in Ezra. Now, Ezra is recording for us the return of the Jews from 70 years of captivity in Babylon. You will probably recall how that Nebuchadnezzar came over the hill, and he took away in various visits what we might term the cream of Jewish society. It was, of course, a judgment of the Lord upon the Jews for their disobedience. And the book of Ezra will tell us about the Jews' struggle to survive and their rebuilding of that which had been destroyed. And I think the message for us, first of all, is a word of encouragement. There is much to challenge us in the book, but we mustn't forget the fact that God does not forget his people. And we see that time and again in the history of Israel, that no matter how bleak the picture was, how few the remnants seemed to be, how little the interest seemed to be, God has preserved that nation. And I think as we read the news today, we see the pressure again upon Israel from not only its near neighbors, but from other countries throughout the world. But we know that that nation will not be destroyed because God has a future for his people Israel. And I think there is a message here for us today. Very sad in this country to hear of assemblies closing. Seems like each month somebody tells me of one or two assemblies, perhaps in a district, in an area, which have closed. We're aware of other assemblies that really are struggling, perhaps just one or two brethren, and things seem perhaps to us very bleak. We look overseas, we see other countries, we see that our assemblies are flourishing, but in this country things seem to be in decline. But there is an encouragement for us that the Lord does not forget his people. I'm sure we will agree that the way that we meet is the way that we believe they met in the New Testament. Things aren't perfect, a long way from it, but they weren't perfect, remember, in the early church. But God does not forget his people. Now, Ezra, of course, is closely linked with the next book, Nehemiah. And just to remind you that Ezra covers the rebuilding of the temple that was destroyed when the Babylonians came and destroyed much of the city of Jerusalem. And then in Nehemiah, we read of the rebuilding of the walls, the reconstruction of the walls. And perhaps if we look at the two books, Nehemiah, perhaps for a lot of us, is a better known book than Ezra. The books cover a period of around 100 years. And in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah form just one book. Now, Stan Evers, in his commentary on Ezra and Nehemiah, says this: these two writers that's Ezra and Nehemiah, call us back to a renewed obedience to God's word, a fresh realization of the power of prayer and wholehearted commitment to the work of God in fellowship with the people of God. And I think that's a great summary of those two books. Now, Ezra is divided up not into two equal parts, but into two separate time periods. Chapter 1 to 6 cover the first return of the Jews from Babylon, from captivity. And that was the return led by a man called Zerubbabel. Then in chapters 7 to 10 inclusive, we pick up the story about 60 years later when Ezra led the second group of returnees coming back to Jerusalem. Now, I've just written down 3 key lessons that I see in the whole book. The first one is obedience. The second one is commitment. And the third one is revival. So we have obedience, we have commitment, and we have revival. Just done a simple outline of the book in chapter 1, verse 1 and to chapter 6, verse 22, the end of chapter 6. We have the struggle to restore the temple. And then in chapter 7 to 10, the end of chapter 10, we have the need for spiritual reformation, the struggle to restore the temple in the first part, and the need for spiritual reformation in the second part. So in essence, we have here lessons on service, if we like some alliteration, we have service, and we have spirituality. Just an outline of chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, we have the proclamation of King Cyrus. And then in verses 5 to 11, the captives return to Jerusalem. So the book is opening in the first year of the reign of King Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great, the king of Persia, believed to be around about 538 years before the birth of Christ. Now, Jeremiah had prophesied some 200 years earlier, and he had stated that the captivity would last for 70 years. So the Jews would be captive. The majority of those who were taken captive would obviously have died out through the time of their captivity. And in effect, that's a whole lifetime or a whole generation. So 70 years. And that's Jeremiah chapter 29 and verse 10. Now, Isaiah actually names Cyrus as the king who would be instrumental in the return of the Jew to Jerusalem. We find that in Isaiah chapter 44, verse 28, and chapter 45 and verse 1. So that is actually remarkable that here we were, Isaiah writing so far, so much in advance of these actual events taking place, and yet he could actually name the king who was to be instrumental in the return of the Jew to Jerusalem. Now, we haven't got any evidence to suggest that Cyrus knew God in any spiritual sense, and yet clearly this king knew a lot about God, the Jehovah, the God of the Bible. And remember, Daniel was prime minister in the court of Cyrus, and it would be nice to think that much of Cyrus's knowledge of Jehovah came from Daniel. And what a lesson that would be in witnessing, that here was Daniel able to witness to the most powerful man in the world. Now, I quite like paraphrases if I just make sure that I let you know that I don't believe that they are a literal translation, but I do like the Message, Eugene Peterson's The Message. It just sometimes wakes you up when you're reading scriptures that you've read many times. And In verse 1, Peterson says this in his paraphrase: God prodded Cyrus, king of Persia. God prodded Cyrus, king of Persia. Then in verse 5, he says, the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, along with the priests and Levites, everyone, in fact, God prodded, set out to build the temple of God in Jerusalem. So everyone that God had prodded set out to build the temple of God in Jerusalem. So we see here that God, if you like, prods unbelievers as well as believers in order that his plans may be fulfilled. And that's an encouragement to us today. Sometimes we wonder about events in the world, the events around us, but we can see that sometimes things happen and we say, well, how has that happened? That man, that woman is not a Christian. How come these things are taking place? But you see, God is able to prod and to use the unbeliever as well as the believer. But I think the lesson for us is this: is God prodding me or prodding you to perform some service for him? That's quite a challenge, isn't it? Is God prodding me or prodding you to undertake some service for him? Now, as we get older, perhaps we feel that we can't do as much. But you know, something we can all do is pray. And I wonder if the Lord sometimes prods us, if we're not able to do what we once could, to just pray a bit more. And he's prodding us perhaps in a certain direction of what we should pray for. Now, we should take notice too here how that the frontline builders, we might say, were supported by their fellow countrymen. That's verses 5 and 6 of chapter 1. Cyrus commanded this of them. Everyone had a part to play. They had a part to play financially, and they had a part to play practically. They had a part to play financially, and they had a part to play practically. Everyone had a part to play, and I think that's something that can get forgotten today. Certainly in assembly life, that can begin to get forgotten. Now, their financial offerings were free will offerings. They made free will financial offerings. And we don't follow the rule of tithing today. You would remember that in the Old Testament, they used to tithe. God had told the people to tithe, and that was to give 10% of their net income. But we're not given any guidelines, any guidance as to how much we should give. But the Bible teaches us in the New Testament, as well as the Old Testament, how important our financial giving is. And you know, perhaps it's a little bit different now with more restrictions on us, but in the past, the box came round or the bag came round on a Sunday morning. And you know, it is so easy to just fumble around for some money to put in the box or in the bag. Sometimes we can even forget and say, oh, I haven't been to the bank. We just pass the bag on, pass the box on. Or perhaps it's less embarrassing if it's at the back, so that we can sidle out without having to show that we haven't put anything in. But you know, our giving, our financial giving, is so important. We have to remember that God no more needs our money than he needed the silver and the gold and the goods and the livestock from the Jews here. His work would still have been completed without their gifts, but he wanted their free will offerings. Why? Because he wants to prove his people's love and devotion to him. You know, I've done this in the past, and I can tell you from experience, it is a humbling exercise. Sit down and just write down what you have spent in the last week on items of luxury, not things that are a matter of life and death, but the luxuries. How much do you and I spend on the luxuries of life? And how much do we give to the Lord and to the Lord's work? You know, I think it's good if we can not just throw money in a bag or pay it straight into an account or whatever, but to really, if we can, to give to something specific. They were giving here to something specific. And it's good if the Lord lays on our hearts, he prods us, if you like, to support a work, to support a worker. And you know, when we give, really, it should be a lot more than we just give on a Sunday morning. That should, I believe, that should not be the be all and end all, that we throw something in a bag or a box and say, well, that's up to the elders to decide what's done with it. I've done my bit. You know, we should also be giving ourselves, taking that responsibility as the Lord lays things upon our heart. And I'm not saying this is easy. It's not always easy to know where to direct funds, who needs them most, and so on. But I think it's something that perhaps we can forget how important our financial giving is. So that was the financial side. Their goods, their gold, their silver, and their goods. But then we have the practical side. Now, we've all got a practical part to play in the local assembly. That's the teaching of the New Testament. You know, it's very concerning that so many local churches and talk to people. I'm not talking about Maidenhead by any means, but I talk to people, and it seems to be fairly general that there are the doers and the don'ters. That in assembly life, in church life, even people in other, dare I say, denominations, but evangelical churches and so on, that there are the doers and the don'ters. And you see, that is never God's way. We know that the assembly is the body, and the Lord has given gifts to the local church, and those gifts need to be exercised. Now, I don't know if I've said this in Maidenhead before, but I'll say it again anyway. Someone said this, that local churches are made up of pillars and caterpillars. And they said that the pillars hold up the church and the caterpillars just crawl in and out. And I haven't forgotten that, because that sometimes can sum up a local church. The pillars, those who are holding it together, and the caterpillars, those that just crawl in and crawl out and don't give anything back to the local church. Now, we've noticed the part that Cyrus played in all of this. Not only did he give permission, though, for the Jews to return, which was a massive thing, he was allowing them to return back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. But we read in verse 7 that he also returned the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had looted when he took the Jews into exile. So he's letting the people go back, and he's giving them back the vessels that were looted from the temple. What can we learn from that? Well, this man Cyrus is an amazing king. You think of the power that he had. A word of his and it was done. And yet he is supporting the work of God. Now, you know, I was thinking about this and thought, what a challenge it is to us as believers when we find more being done for good by unbelievers than by believers. And you know, that can even happen in the local church. Perhaps, and this is just a tiny example, but perhaps we have a tea. Let's say we have a tea on a Sunday afternoon, for instance, and we invite unbelievers in. It's very sad if we see unbelievers who are keen to clear tables, to wash up, to support what's being done, and believers just sitting around doing nothing. Now, that is just a small example, but it's very sad when unbelievers are doing more for the good of the local church than the believers themselves. Now, something we need to remember is that these Jews who were returning had never been to Jerusalem before. They were a new generation. They had been born in Babylon. And no doubt their lives were fairly comfortable. Remember, those that were taken in the various stages, Daniel would have gone in the first stage, Ezekiel probably in the second stage, but these were let's say the cream of society, that not many were left. The Babylonians had this great idea that by bringing those who were the more intelligent, let's say, and all those that could cause rebellion into Babylon and integrating them into their society, that was far safer than trying to put them under the cosh, if you like, with the idea they might rebel. So what they were done, they were brought into Babylonian society, and no doubt this new generation had grown up in comfort. The journey back was about 1,000 miles. Now, they weren't going to jump on onto EasyJet, or they weren't likely to get onto a high-speed train or jump in the car. This was 1,000 tough miles that they would have to traverse to get to Jerusalem. And many would not have wished to go. And we see the evidence that many of them didn't go. Perhaps they feared the trip and thought, really, 1,000 miles, I'm going to really struggle. Really, I don't want to go. I'm quite happy where I am. Or maybe they had got businesses. They've got positions of power. They've got their friends and their family in Babylon. And so they've said, no thanks, we'll stay where we are. So the lesson for us is perhaps quite clear. You know, we can be so settled in our Christian lives that we don't want anything to disturb them. God may be prodding us to do something, but we're wriggling around trying to ignore him because we're quite comfortable. And I have to say that most Christians in this country lead a comfortable life. We heard, just thinking of this, we heard of a dear lady in Angola who she hadn't got very much, and she was visiting a sick relative. And while she was gone, her house was broken into and her furniture and her pots and pans were stolen. And this lady had nothing. She was a believer and she had nothing. She couldn't just go and buy more. Well, the believers helped her out and bought her new possessions. And they'd also arranged for a steel door to be put on to protect her property. But how many of us really are struggling? How many of us really, if we had a few pots and pans and a bit of furniture stolen, that it would make such a difference? But her life, as she saw it, was ruined because she'd lost these things. Very easy for us to be very comfortable. And we can be comfortable in our assembly lives as well. And, you know, we can all feel like this. We don't want anything to be stirred up. You know, we like the way things are. And sadly, so many assemblies have felt that way and have in the end closed. Now, I'm not saying that we change, we just throw out our doctrine or anything like that. But what I'm saying is are we perhaps a little bit fussy about who comes in? Do we worry that, well, really, we preach the gospel, but we want people of a certain standard, if we like, or class to be saved? We don't want any drug addicts, thank you very much. We don't want any drunkards. We don't want anybody who's been married 3 times to come in. We just want people like ourselves. You know, we perhaps can become too settled. We can be settled in our worship. When we come together on a Sunday morning, how often we can slip into a pattern. We know which brother is going to get up when. We may know which hymn he's going to give out. We may know the content of his prayer. We may know who is going to minister. And we're comfortable with it. We don't want anybody to upset the apple cart. But you know, the question is, have we become stale? Has the life that we once had been dragged out and we just don't want anything to change? You know, these Jews were no doubt in Babylon and they wanted the temple to be rebuilt. They knew all about the temple. But many of them didn't want that activity of rebuilding to involve themselves. It was a case of, here am I, send him, send her. You know, that's easy, isn't it, to be like that? We want the assembly to flourish. We want things to happen. We want to see people saved. But I have to challenge myself, how much effort am I willing to put in to see that happen? I wonder if we're really prepared for the rigors that true service requires. Now, you may have heard of the Pony Express. If you've ever watched a Western or know anything about the American West, you will have heard probably of the Pony Express. Now, I wonder if I went round, which I won't, and asked you how long you think the Pony Express was in existence. Because it's quite well known in the history of the American West. Well, I can tell you it operated for 19 months only. And being a rider with the Pony Express, delivering the mail, was a very tough job. A rider was expected to cover 100 miles a day on horseback. And he was expected to ride not only through the day, but also through the night. He would change horses every 10 to 15 miles because these horses had to be going at high speed. Once a horse got tired, they had to change horses. And along with the mail, he would carry a knife and he would carry a gun for his own protection. Now, listen to this. I thought this was really interesting. This was an advertisement placed in a San Francisco newspaper looking for riders. It said this: wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred. But you know, despite all those dangers, there was never a shortage of riders. Throughout that 19 months, there was never a shortage of riders, despite the dangers and the difficulty that it involved. You know, if only there was no shortage of Christian workers in the UK today, those who are willing to take the message of the gospel out to those communities all around us. You know, we can be soft, can't we? We can get very soft. And I speak for myself. My wife's listening, so she will say it, even if I don't, that it's easy to become soft. It's easy to say, well, really, you know, it's a bit cold out, it's a bit hot out, I feel a bit tired, I can't do this, I can't do that. Always easy to be negative. But we think we've got the message that everybody needs. How willing are we to take the trouble and the effort to get the message out into our communities? We also need to regularly assess our priorities. I wonder where the local assembly is in my list of priorities. I want it to flourish, but am I really prepared? As I said before, am I really prepared to build it, to help to build it? Or am I happy to leave that to others? You know, it is very easy, isn't it, to make excuses. What about my business? What about my home? What about my family? What about my friends? What about my studies? What about my hobbies? What about my other interests? You know, I don't know if you have a separate prayer meeting, but whatever meetings you have, but I just thought if friends were to ask me over on an evening when we have a prayer meeting in Harrow, I wonder if I hesitate and decide which to go to. Do I want to go to friends for a meal or family for a meal, or do I want to go to the prayer meeting? Do I plan my holidays so that as far as I'm able, I can get to meet with a local assembly? Or do I just see a holiday as a rest from church life? You know, this is an ongoing challenge for us. It doesn't matter if we've just become a Christian or whether we've been a Christian for many years. These things are a challenge. Where are our priorities? The priorities here for some were to stay in Babylon. Others recognized the need and they took up the baton and they traveled back, or they traveled to Jerusalem to help to rebuild the temple. In my own Christian life, where am I? Where are you in your Christian life? You can be honest with yourself because you're not answerable to anybody else. But you know, it's much easier to watch TV than to study the Bible. It's much easier to sit in the garden or to undertake a hobby than to pray. And one day we will stand before the Lord and we will have to, and it sends a shiver down my spine. I will have to stand before the Lord and give account for how I have lived my life. A very sobering thought. Now, chapter 2, verses 1 to 63, we have the captives who returned. And then in verses 64 to 67, the number of people and livestock who returned. And then verses 68 to 70, we have the gifts for the temple. Now, I think most of us, if not all of us, have a tendency to skip over chapters that have a lot of names and numbers. Very easy to say, well, this isn't going to help me very much. You look at chapter 2, it's just full of the children of this one, the men of that, the children of this, and so on. And it's very easy to say, well, really, I want to get onto something a little bit more practical here. But let's just stop and think about what we can learn here in chapter 2, or some of the things that we can learn. You know, in the secular world, sometimes we enjoy lists. Now, when I was a kid, I loved to read statistics related to cricket. I used to get these books, or my parents used to buy me these cricket books, and they would have all the statistics in there. They'd have the batting average, the bowling averages, the catches, the leg before wickets, and so on. And now, even in football, it's all down to statistics, how much ground somebody has covered in a match, and so on. But when we come to the Bible, perhaps we just switch off and we say, well, we're not really interested in what the Bible says regarding numbers and so on. But, you know, we can learn an awful lot. Perhaps the reason we do that is because we're detached from the people. When I was a kid, poring over these cricket statistics, I felt some sort of relationship with the cricketers because I'd watch the cricket, I know who they were, I'd see them playing, and I'd play cricket with friends, and also Sabutio cricket, if anybody remembers that, and start to work all the statistics out for that game and so on. So feel really sort of directly attached to it. But when it comes to the Bible, we read a lot of names of people that really seem so far away from us that really that they seem to have no relevance. But if we get the mindset that these were real people and they were instrumental in shaping the history that we have in the Bible, perhaps our attitude towards them will be different. What we read in chapter 2 is important. Remember, what we have here are Jews who are coming to Jerusalem from exile. These are people who were willing to travel to a country they had never seen to undertake the work of God. And if for that reason alone, each one of them is vital, each one of them should interest us. So in this chapter, we've got a record of those who returned to Judah, to Jerusalem, under the leadership of a man called Zerubbabel. And in verses 3 to 19, we have lists of those who returned by their parentage. And then in verses 20 to 35, those who returned listed by their hometown. Now, there's a special mention made of the priests in verses 36 to 39. Then the Levites in verses 40 to 42. And then the Nethinim, they are just the servants in the temple, the Nethinim in verses 43 to 54. Now, those who couldn't prove that they were descended from the priestly line were prevented from taking up their duties until proof was gained, we read, through Urim and Thummim, the lights and perfections, the two stones on the high priest's ephod. Now, we're not told why that couldn't be determined, but nevertheless, there was obviously a problem. We're told in Numbers chapter 16 and verse 40 that no one apart from a descendant of Aaron should be allowed to burn incense before the Lord. A holy God demanded holiness from those who worship him. Now, the lesson here, just a simple one. I like to think that in assembly life, we welcome believers into our fellowships as much as possible, but we do need to be discerning. We do need to be careful. There's a lot of error outside, and if we aren't careful, then a lot of damage can be done in the local assembly. Just two matters to clarify here. First of all, the Tershatha in verse 63, he's the governor, that's Zerubbabel. And then we should note that Nehemiah that we read of in verse 2 is not the cupbearer of Artaxerxes that we read in the book of Nehemiah. He lived about 80 years later, and that Mordecai in verse 2 is not the man that we read of in the book of Esther. So they're two different people, although they've got the same names. Now, there are two key elements that I want to just think about for the last few minutes here in chapter 2. First of all, there was focus. There was focus on the service these Jews were about to perform. There was a job to do, and there was a roll call for those who were going to do it. There was a job to do, and there was a roll call for those who were going to do it. And there were not only people, but there were provisions as well. We read that in verses 66 and 67. Now, in the previous verse, 65, that we read also that there were servants and maids along with singers. Now, what does that tell me? That tells me that things had been thought through. What's the lesson? You know, in assembly life, we should be focused. That might seem a strange thing to say, but I don't think it is. We need to focus on what has to be done. So in your assembly, are you focused on what needs to be done? I'm talking about teaching. I'm talking about evangelism. I'm talking about corporate prayer and so on and so forth. Focus on what has to be done and focus on who is responsible for doing it. You know, we should have a plan. I don't want this to sound too much like a business. We should have a plan, though. We should have a vision. Where there isn't a vision, the people perish. We need a vision, and we need to focus on that vision or on that plan and ensure that we're able to meet its demands by way of both workers and resources. You know, we need to be careful that we're not sacrificing quality on the altar of quantity. People might say, well, you need to cut your cloth. And I think, in a sense, that's true. The church should have a vision and it should be backed up by a plan. But we need to know that we've got the resources to carry it through. You see, we can be diligent in our business life, but we can just muddle along in Christian service. And I don't believe that that is right. I don't believe that what we do in business, and although I've been retired a few years, we had focus, we had vision, we had business plans, we had all these things, and we knew what resources we need. So each year, or perhaps 3 months, we look at the human resources. We look at what needed doing and have we got the people and the right people to do the work. You know, it's not right that in assembly life we just hope for the best. That's not honoring to the Lord. An article in the New York Times some years ago said this: when an institution, and I know this is a secular thing, but when an institution no longer knows what it is doing, it starts trying to do everything. When an institution no longer knows what it is doing, it starts trying to do everything. And I think in assembly life, we need to be realistic. We can set up meetings for this, that, and the other. But of course, it's going to fall flat. I'm not saying the Lord can't work, and if we pray, but we need to be sensible. We need to make sure that we've got everything, that we're able to focus on what our vision is. So if we're looking to work with children and we have a children's meeting, we need to make sure that we've got the resource, those who are gifted to work with children, that we've got the space, if only we had enough children coming, to carry the work out. If we're going to hold a gospel campaign, who is going to be there? Not only the speaker, but who is going to support the work? If we have an open air work, who is going to support the open air work? And we can throw everything out there, but I don't believe it's honoring to the Lord if we just try so many things. In other words, throw enough mud at the wall that hopefully some of it will stick. So I believe we need a vision, and we need to focus on that vision. Secondly, there was a willingness among the people. Around 50,000 Jews, plus servants and maids and singers, were prepared to step out in faith. And we read in verse 68 that when some of the heads of the families got to Jerusalem, they freely gave of their wealth. We've considered this earlier. Now, if we add up the numbers, they only come to 29,818. I'm sure the mathematicians among you will have already spotted that. But it's suggested that that's because women and children are not included in that number. We've touched on this before, but I believe we have it here again. There's a need today for willing Christians. One of the things we really need today are willing Christians. Those of us who are willing to sacrifice, make sacrifices for the Lord, both with our lives and with our possessions. Why didn't the whole nation return? Well, we've considered it, because a large number were not willing to answer God's call. God is calling all of us to some work, which is going to cost us time and it's going to cost us money. There's not one of us, if we're a Christian, are excluded. All of us are called to do something, and all of us are called to give something of our possessions. And I wonder if I'm really heeding that call. That is a massive challenge. Again, Stan Evers says this: our love, now this is I love this, but it really is challenging. Our love for Christ can be measured by how much time and money we give to him. You know, that is just hits you in the heart, doesn't it? That we can say we love the Lord. We can tell people, well, I love the Lord. We can pray, I love you, Lord, and so on. But he says our love for Christ can be measured by how much time and money we give to him. Now, I wonder where I would be on a scale if that was measurable. Those returning Israelites could be counted. But the bigger question is, could they be counted on? These Israelites could be counted, but the big question is, could they be counted on? Now, I don't know if you have at Parkside, I don't know if you have an annual meeting when you talk over or look at the accounts for the year and so on and so forth. We've had one every year at Belmont for how many years? But something that is always given out is how many people are in fellowship. Now, perhaps we've all got a different definition of what fellowship means. I don't believe it just means having your name on a register. But anyway, so we say 35, 20, 30, whatever number we've got. It's easy to count the number of people, easy to count the number of people here. But how many can be counted on? How many people in your assembly do you feel can be counted on? That if there's a need, they will rise to the call. And bringing it back to the personal level, can I be counted on in the work of the Lord? Can the assembly count on me? Can the Lord, moreover, count on me? Or am I just a number that is recorded in a book, in a register, in a report? I can be counted, but can I be counted on? So there we have it. I think the overriding theme that I've tried to bring out tonight is one of commitment. And if we go away with nothing else tonight, let us take away the challenge, myself included, as to my level, your level of commitment to the Lord and to his service. Thank you for listening. I hope that has made some sense, and I hope I haven't gone too much away from what the scriptures say in those two chapters.